The comment was delivered casually. That was what made it sting. Anthony Hopkins was sitting at the edge of a rehearsal stage, script folded neatly on his knee, watching the director pace in tight circles. The crew was quiet. Not because they'd been told to be, but because everyone could feel the temperature drop. The director was a legend. The kind whose name alone could secure funding, prestige, and silence dissent. He'd worked with icons, broken careers, built others. His opinions were treated as facts long before they were spoken. He stopped pacing and looked directly at Hopkins. "You know," he said, almost conversationally, "this approach of yours, it doesn't work." Hopkins didn't react. The director continued. "You're too restrained," he said. "Too internal. You don't project. You don't command the frame." Hopkins nodded once, inviting him to continue. "You can't act like this," the director added. "Not in my film." The words hung there. Not shouted. Not cruel. Certain. A few crew members exchanged glances. This wasn't feedback. This was a verdict. Hopkins waited. The director seemed surprised by the lack of resistance. "You hear me?" he asked. "I do," Hopkins replied calmly. "You understand what I'm saying?" "Yes," Hopkins said. "You want more." The director smiled thinly. "I want something that reads." Hopkins looked back at the empty stage. "It already does," he said. The director laughed. "Not from where I'm standing." Hopkins turned to him. "Then perhaps," he said gently, "you're standing too far away." The director stiffened. "That's not how this works," he said. "You don't lecture me about perspective." Hopkins smiled faintly. "I wouldn't dare." The director leaned closer. "I've been doing this longer than you've been relevant." Hopkins nodded. "That's true. And I'm telling you," the director continued, "your style doesn't belong here." Hopkins folded his script. "What style is that?" he asked. "Whatever this is," the director said, gesturing vaguely. "Quiet. Minimal. Invisible." Hopkins considered the word. "Invisible," he repeated. "Yes," the director said. "Audiences don't pay for invisible." Hopkins stood, not defensively, not confrontationally. "They pay for truth," he said. The director scoffed. "Truth doesn't sell tickets. Presence does." Hopkins met his gaze. "Presence," he said, "isn't volume." The director's jaw tightened. "You think you're smarter than me?" Hopkins shook his head. "No. I think we're speaking different languages." The director exhaled sharply. "This isn't a debate," he said. "I'm telling you to change." Hopkins was quiet for a long moment. The crew waited. Then Hopkins said something no one expected. "All right." The director blinked. "All right." "Yes," Hopkins said. "I'll change." Relief flashed across the director's face. Brief, triumphant. "Good," he said. "Then we'll." "But not today," Hopkins added. The director frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means," Hopkins said, "I'll show you first." The director laughed again. "Show me what?" "What you're asking me to abandon," Hopkins replied. There was a murmur among the crew. The director crossed his arms. "Fine. Impress me." Hopkins walked to the center of the stage. No flourish. No announcement. He took his position and waited. "Action," the director said sarcastically. Hopkins didn't move. Seconds passed. Someone coughed. Then Hopkins spoke. The line was simple, almost throwaway. But the way he delivered it, measured, grounded, unforced, shifted the air. He didn't push emotion. He let it surface. He didn't raise his voice. He allowed silence to do the work. The crew leaned in without realizing it. Hopkins finished the scene. Silence followed. Not applause. Attention. The director frowned. "Again," he said. Hopkins did it again. Slightly different. Still restrained. Still precise. Still impossible to ignore. The director shook his head. "You're hiding." Hopkins stepped forward. "No," he said. "I'm trusting." "Trusting what?" the director snapped. "The audience," Hopkins replied. The director scoffed. "Audiences need to be told what to feel." Hopkins smiled gently. "Only when we don't feel it ourselves." The director stared at him. "You're impossible," he said. Hopkins nodded. "That's usually when something works." The director waved a hand. "We're done for today." The crew dispersed, buzzing quietly. As Hopkins gathered his things, the director called after him. "You won't survive doing it this way," he said. "You can't act like that forever." Hopkins paused at the edge of the stage. He turned back. "You're right," he said. "I can't." The director smirked. Finally, Hopkins finished the thought. "I can only act like this when it's honest." The director laughed dismissively. "We'll see." That night, Hopkins went home unsettled, but not shaken. He'd heard variations of that critique his entire career. Too quiet, too internal, too controlled. He poured a glass of water and sat in silence, replaying the exchange, not with anger, but curiosity. The director wasn't wrong about one thing. The industry rewarded noise. But Hopkins had learned something else over the years, something no one taught directly. Noise fades. Precision endures. The next day, Hopkins arrived early. Before the director. Before the crew. He stood alone on the stage and ran the scene again. Not louder. Cleaner. He removed excess. Stripped away safety. By the time the director arrived, Hopkins was ready. They ran the scene again. The director watched closely this time. Something had changed. Not in volume. In gravity. When Hopkins finished, the director didn't speak immediately. That, he said finally, was different. Hopkins nodded. Yes. The director frowned. You didn't do what I asked. No, Hopkins said. I did what the scene needed. The director stared at him. You think you know better than me. Hopkins met his gaze. I think, he said, you taught me something important. The director crossed his arms. What's that? That technique, Hopkins said, is only impressive when it disappears. The director scoffed. You're still dodging. Hopkins shook his head. No, he said. I'm inviting you to look closer. The director laughed. You can't dance like this, he said mockingly. You're offbeat. Hopkins smiled. Then, he said, perhaps I'm not dancing. The director frowned. What are you doing then? Hopkins answered quietly. Listening. The director stared at him, uncertain whether he'd just been challenged or taught. And for the first time since rehearsals began, he didn't dismiss the silence that followed. He felt it, even if he didn't yet understand what it meant. What happened next, how that lesson would return to the director years later, and why Hopkins' restraint would outlast every criticism, had not revealed itself yet. But the foundation had been laid, not through argument, but through something far more unsettling to a legend used to control. Being shown, not told, that there was another way. The director didn't sleep well that night. That, too, unsettled him. He told himself it was the schedule, the pressure, the familiar weight of carrying a production on his shoulders. But in the quiet moments, those he usually outran with work, Hopkins' words returned. Perhaps I'm not dancing. I'm listening. It irritated him precisely because it didn't argue back. The next morning, the director arrived earlier than usual. He took his seat behind the monitor before the crew had fully settled, coffee untouched, eyes fixed on the empty stage as if it might confess something. Hopkins arrived moments later. No greeting beyond a nod. No tension. No defensiveness. Just readiness. They began the scene again. This time, the director said nothing during the first take. Hopkins played it with the same restraint, but now there was a sharper edge beneath it. Not louder. Not bigger. Clearer. The pauses were placed like punctuation. The stillness carried intention rather than caution. The director felt it before he understood it. He leaned forward. Again, he said. They ran it again. And again. Each time, Hopkins adjusted. Not to please, not to appease, but to refine. The performance tightened like a lens being brought slowly into focus. The director watched the monitor, waiting for the moment it would lose him. It never did. Cut. The director exhaled. That shouldn't work, he muttered. Hopkins heard him. Why not? Hopkins asked. The director hesitated. Because you're not giving anything away. Hopkins nodded. Exactly. That's not acting, the director said. Hopkins smiled faintly. It's listening under pressure. The director rubbed his temples. Audiences need clarity. They need invitation, Hopkins replied. Clarity follows. The director stood and paced again, but the pacing had changed. Slower. Thoughtful. Less performative. You know, he said. When I started, they told me the same thing. Hopkins looked at him. What did they tell you? That I was indulgent, the director said. Too obsessed with precision. That I needed to loosen up. And did you? Hopkins asked. The director snorted. No. I learned how to hide it. Hopkins didn't respond. The director stopped pacing. You're doing the opposite, he said. You're hiding nothing. Hopkins met his eyes. That's the risk. They moved on to other scenes. Some louder. Some faster. Hopkins adapted without abandoning himself. He allowed energy where it belonged. Withheld it where it didn't. The director watched closely now, not hunting for errors, but studying choices. By the end of the week, something undeniable had happened. The crew noticed it first. They stopped whispering during Hopkins' scenes. They leaned in. The set quieted without being asked. The director noticed it next. Actors began adjusting their own performances around Hopkins, not out of intimidation, but alignment. They stopped competing for space. They trusted it would be there. One afternoon, after a particularly difficult scene, the director didn't cut immediately. He let the silence linger. Then he turned to Hopkins. "That pause," he said. "I didn't plan that." Hopkins nodded. "The scene did." The director smiled despite himself. "That's infuriating," he said. Hopkins smiled back. "It usually is." The film wrapped. During post-production, the director sat alone in the editing room, watching Hopkins' footage. He tried, out of habit, to tighten it, to trim pauses, to speed up exchanges. Every time he did, something collapsed. The scene lost weight. He leaned back, frustrated. "Damn it," he muttered. The editor glanced at him. "What's wrong?" The director hesitated. "Nothing," he said. "Everything's right." The film premiered quietly. No spectacle. No grand campaign. But the reactions were immediate. Critics didn't praise the performances for their intensity. They praised their restraint. Audiences described feeling held, drawn in, unable to look away. One review mentioned Hopkins specifically. "He doesn't perform the role. He creates space for it." The director read that line twice. Months later, at a festival panel, the director was asked about working with Hopkins. "He challenged you," the moderator said. "Didn't he?" The director smiled. "Yes," he said, "but not the way I expected." "How so?" the moderator pressed. "He didn't fight me," the director replied. "He didn't try to win." "What did he do then?" The director paused. "He showed me something I'd forgotten," he said. "What was that?" "That mastery isn't loud," the director said. "It's patient." Hopkins watched the panel from the audience. He didn't smile. He didn't need to. Years later, a young actor approached Hopkins after a screening. "They say you don't project," the actor said nervously. "That you're too quiet." Hopkins nodded. "Who says?" "Everyone," the actor replied. Hopkins smiled gently. "Then listen carefully," he said. "They're not hearing you yet." The actor frowned. "What should I do?" Hopkins answered simply. "Stop dancing for approval," he said. "Start listening for truth." The actor nodded, not fully understanding, but remembering. Across the room, the director watched the exchange. He remembered a different rehearsal, a different confrontation, a moment when he'd mistaken control for clarity. Later that night, the director admitted something to a colleague. "I used to think presence was about command," he said. "Now I think it's about restraint." The colleague raised an eyebrow. "That's a change." The director nodded. "Anthony Hopkins taught me that." The colleague smiled. "Did he say it outright?" The director shook his head. "No," he said. "He showed me." That was the lesson. Not that Hopkins was right and the director was wrong, but that there are forms of mastery you can't argue with, only encounter. Hopkins never corrected the insult directly. He never said, "You were wrong." He let the work answer. And in doing so, he taught something better than rebuttal. That when someone tells you that you can't dance, the most powerful response isn't to dance louder. It's to move so truthfully that they realize dancing was never the point.